All right, we are connected. Hello, everyone. I am Serena, and I'm the Chief of Staff at Gitar. Alongside me, I have Gautam, our co-founder. Today, we're today we're going to cover best practices for migrations, breaking it down into concrete steps and milestones, de-risking that timeline, getting executive sponsorship, and investing in tools and automation. Be sure to use the chat below and input any questions you may have. We'll definitely save time at the end for some Q&A. Before we get started, though, I'd love to see if anyone in the audience has any upcoming migrations. If you could fill out the poll for us, we'll love to hear from you. All right, Gautam, why don't you get us started by giving us an overview of your experience with migrations?
Sounds good. Thanks for that intro, Selena. So, hey everyone, my name is Kotam, one of the co-founders at Gitar. Previously, I was at Uber for almost a decade. And when I joined mid 2014, it was a really cool company. Not many people have heard about Uber yet. There was a lot of building going on. Lots of new stuff was being explored. And no one was thinking about code maintenance or migrations, right? You just keep building stuff. That's the fun time. And over my career, I started realizing that as code got more complex, things get piled up. There's tech debt. Things need to get migrated to newer versions of a library or a new vendor tool because you don't want to maintain like a legacy internal tool. And it was really painful. For example, I remember doing like a migration of the Guava library, which is very common in Java. And it has so many different versions that break. And I think the first time we did it, it took us about 2 months, which is very surprisingly fast, I think, for in many cases. But we got it done, and we were like, hey, this is just too long, right? It's a really painful migration. And over the years, we built a lot of automation and tooling to make this less painful. And I think the last time we did it before I left Uber, I think it took only like a week, and most of that was just getting code reviews. So definitely a huge difference in terms of how long it took to get that done and the right investments you need to get there. Sareen, do you have any other stories like this from migrations from places you worked at?
Yeah, so as a former security PM, I've tangentially been involved in migrations. But I did hear about a company that ended up spending 2 months migrating a subset of code from a legacy framework to a new framework, only to realize that subset of code was dead code. And I also recently came across a LinkedIn post where someone shared that during one of their first migration projects, they accidentally disqualified hundreds of customers from receiving a loan.
Wow.
So those customers needed the loans to like pay bills and rent and deal with emergencies. They end up having to get their customer service team involved to course correct, which is, as you can imagine, was a huge increase in workload and cost. They also, I think the key takeaway from this engineering experience was like migrations aren't just about shifting code around. When things go wrong, it can negatively impact people's lives. And the reality is a lot of teams today, there's such a push to do so much with less. Teams are very lean, and the migration itself can be very costly, but also if mistakes happen along the way, it can even have a greater cost in terms of business impact. With that said, though, Gautam, do you have any best practices that you would like to lean us in on doing migrations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to kind of echo that point, from my experience working on migrations, I think it kind of changes based on the scale at which you are on. But usually, most of the migrations tend to have like a defined pathway from what I found. So the very first thing is obviously understanding before you set out even migrate something, like understanding the why is very important. Like analyze, for example, how many teams will be impacted, what's the most critical code that needs this migration, right? And this is important because like it can be a painful journey, as you noted, and can have a lot of risk associated. So identifying the most critical code that needs it and make sure that you prioritize that, and also make sure that you're aligning with business. And we'll talk about that in the next section. The other best practice I can think of is automation. So just to kind of like outline some of the top ones that I found over the many years. Whenever possible, automate. And this can be counterintuitive to folks who don't really understand, maybe like, hey, when should I actually automate? Because it can be an investment upfront to invest in tooling or automation, and you may not even know, hey, is it actually worth the time and effort spent if the migration is short-lived? So it does, I think, have other benefits. For example, there's a lot of like human error involved when you migrate stuff. And surprisingly, the bottlenecks are in code review time rather than actual migration. So the more you can get to like a predictable output, the less time you'll spend in review to like review those mistakes. So automation can help in other ways that have second order effects, right? And we'll cover some of that later as well. Another thing that I learned painfully was testing early and often. There were some migrations at Uber which caused like some outages, and some of these are like very hard to find. We think we test enough, but it's usually not enough. Like we've seen some scenarios where you write all your unit tests, you write some test analyses, you roll it out, everything looks good, and a week later there is a slowly growing memory leak that you never detected because you haven't actually run like a stress test over a longer period of time. And this is the stuff that you just learn with experience, that the more critical the systems are, the more thorough your testing needs to be, and make sure that you're testing it often, right? So sometimes, like as you're migrating, you might decide to course correct and change pieces. In those cases, like rerunning tests can also be very important. So having a robust testing strategy before you even set out is key. That also helps with like things like preventing regressions, right? So one of the other things that I've learned as a best practice is, I believe like back at Uber when we were doing a Java framework migration from I think Drop Visit to Spring Boot, variant of Spring Boot. We had like a numerator where number of services we migrated and denominator with like the number of total Java services. We kept migrating and we realized the denominator kept increasing. So this is weird. So our progress tracker was always like showing constant line. And you're like, hey, we're making so much effort. Why are we not moving? And then we realized that we never prevented people from not using the old framework. So that was a good learning lesson. Like preventing regression is key. So make sure your denominators are not moving target, because then you'll never get done. So locking
you always have a leaky bucket.
Yeah, you have a leaky bucket. That's another way to put it. Like you want to plug the hole in the leaky bucket early on. So preventing regressions is very important. Like so you have like a defined golden path for new code, and enforce quality gates so that the old code is no longer being used or cannot be even introduced. Right, that's very important. And to actually make this successful, one of the things I think teams overlook is documentation and training. A lot of people talk about documentation. What I mean by this is more, whenever you change something, folks who are used to muscle memory of doing things a certain way can feel like lost when they start using a new system. One of the examples I can give is we migrated from a build system Gradle to Buck and then to Bazel, and the way we kind of like soften the landing there was we created a ton of documentation ahead of time, and we created some form of wrapper where the commands were very similar to how the previous tool used to work, even though it did different things under the hood. So the learning curve was much easier for them to understand. And over time, as people got used to using the new tool, we can introduce new concepts. So be gentle with the people who actually use the core of the tools in the end is important. So document and train, socialize, have office hours, really get feedback very early. And if you're testing and you're documenting along while you're doing these things incrementally, it can help quite a bit to kind of do the large scale migrations down the line. So definitely like don't overlook documentation and training.
So also help with new folks that are onboarding, and also for compliance purposes, you always need all the documentation you can get. You mentioned some of the things about practices. Is there anything that you'd recommend not doing?
That's an interesting question. I think I talked about automation. One other thing which I believe every migration goes through is if there is a program manager who's usually leading a migration, they love to create a tracker or a spreadsheet. There's always this tracker for every migration where everyone's like reporting progress or posting updates to. Lightweight process is good, but I found, for example, when process gets too heavy, when people are required to just keep track of things more than actually getting the work done, it slows down everything. So as much as possible, try to avoid process. Have some, which is enough to make progress, but don't try to add more and more. I mean, I've seen like cases where we had like a Jira tracker and then a spreadsheet and then maybe another task issue tracker on like your GitHub, and they're never in sync. And then there's someone else hired to just keep these in sync, and that's just a bunch of process. And then the actual work is just like, hey, why are we not making progress? I've seen like efforts kind of like take years just trying to like add more and more process. So avoid the temptation for process is a big not to do is what I would say.
You spend most of your time just trying to update all the trackers when you have so many different processes and Jira trackers involved.
It's not even funny. I think there was a migration to go from an old tracking tool to a new tracking tool.
No way.
in middle of another migration, I'm like, it's like levels deep, like the movie Inception. You just keep going deeper.
Yeah, as a former PM, I'm not in the middle of a project changing project management tools, and it's my number one. When I'm done, then we'll move over. You can always have some long tail afterwards. You mentioned making sure that as part of best practices, like the business impact, that it lies with goals and business impacts. How would you go about that?
That's a good question. I think we talked a little bit about best practices. Now, I think I briefly mentioned at the very start, like, should you even be taking on this migration? It's kind of hard because, especially if you're someone who's on like a centralized team who sees the pain of outdated dependencies or legacy stuff that your developers keep complaining about, it can be hard to justify, take that pain and say, hey, this is how it impacts the business, right? Like making a clear ROI case is always nebulous. So I think some of the strategies that I found very useful is usually when you do things like planning or KRs, there are higher level sort of like goals for the business that tend to be around things like cost saving or efficiency or developer happiness. We need to find a way to map the migration goals to the top level things that leadership is always looking at. And it's not possible in all cases, and sometimes the timing might just be right. When, for example, there could be an incident that happened, so leadership might say, hey, our dependencies are out of date, security issue happened, we need to get these up to date. So that's kind of like the right moment to strike and say, hey, okay, so we have this thing that's been kind of pending, we would love to get this done, so let's allocate resources, right? So sometimes the timing just cannot be right even. So making a clear ROI case can mean more than just mapping to metric. It could also mean what's important for that business, strategic goals or like short-term or long-term goals for that half, right? And then we also have, for example, the other thing that people tend to struggle with is like, when I talked about strategic goals, one of the problems with like the larger scale ones is when we did the build system migration, it was supposed to take almost like 3 years, right? Because there's a lot of moving pieces, there's a lot of like changes to code, process, and training. In that case, like it's hard to like just say, hey, we're gonna have 3 years of migration and then we'll see returns at the end. Right? That's just not gonna fly. You need to have a way to say, okay, 6 months later, here's the impact we can expect to get, clearly defined, and here's how we'll get there. So that's kind of like breaking it down, and we'll talk about milestones a bit later, but kind of like laying out the goals of the migration with business goals is very important. So the other issue is that your business can change a lot in 3 years. So you might not even know how things will change. So always try to like set like, even though the migrations are very long running, make sure that your impact is still aligned with like the quarterly or yearly sort of like priorities, right? Other thing I think which is very useful I found is like, if you can secure executive sponsorship, it can make things move much faster. So this usually happens when you can identify someone who's like a director or manager level who get the importance of the migration and can advocate for your project at the highest levels. Because when people talk about it at the higher levels, it's easier to find resources. So one of the strategies that I use for executive sponsorship is obviously like having some sort of meetings with them and making them understand why their business goals might be impacted if you don't do this migration. And sometimes it takes time, but when things come around, the soft skill aspect of like engineering is very important here. So I was the principal engineer at Uber. This is one of the things that they don't teach you when you're writing code is like how do you talk to leadership and make them realize the importance of some of these things and bridge that gap between technical and non-technical knowledge is important.
So you would go about getting executive leadership, you're saying, to summarize, getting and showing the overall business impact, how you improve in performance of the product or use case. What else were you mentioning that would be a way to get business executive sponsorship?
So another thing I think we typically hear is, okay, so you're doing a big change. Change is usually like a human tendency to assume that, okay, that's risky, right?
Right.
How do you minimize risk? That's something that everyone asks, right? Typically, the formula is always like do it in phases, right? So try to have like more defined, like smaller chunks of work you can deliver. Have a way to roll back whenever possible. It's not possible in all cases, but as much as possible, have things like config or feature flags to be able to like roll back quickly. That saved like a ton of work for us when we were doing like very risky migrations, especially if it's risky and you don't have a rollback plan. It's probably not going to get like blessed like executive sponsorship leadership because they're on the on the hook for that, right?
A fail-safe is always important. Going back to business impact and executive sponsorship. So let's say you get your executive team to agree to migrating off legacy code. How do you pitch the idea or justify the ROI or the business impact for automating the code migrations?
So that's a really good one. I think we talked about automation briefly. Usually, automation involves like some sort of investment upfront, right? And one of the typical things that we see with teams who are new to this is like they think that we should automate everything as much as possible. But in fact, like the first thing to understand is like where are the bottlenecks in the whole migration process? Is it actually code? Is it in review? Is it in testing? Is it in rollout? Is it in just getting approvals? Is it in like training your other non-technical staff as to like the product changes you might need to make because of this migration? Not having that breakdown can mean that you might be automating the wrong thing. Right? So once you identify that and say that, hey, the bottleneck is in one part of this whole journey, then it becomes much clearer where the investment should go. That also makes it very easy to like pitch that, hey, we're able to like de-risk things like timelines and business goals by automating the most problematic pieces of this whole journey.
So you just mentioned de-risking the timeline. So maybe let's jump over to that. How do you go about creating one, you mentioned testing and so forth. I imagine that will help you establish the timeline, but how do you go about identifying what the key milestones are? And again, the timeline. I've worked at a company where it was a quarter initiative where no product releases are going to happen in that quarter because we were going to migrate off of a legacy platform onto a new platform. And I will say that that quarter, 3-month initiative turned into 3 years. So how do you avoid planning for something that's claim it's going to take a quarter and then still work on it 3 years later?
The straight answer is actually it's hard, right? So we basically don't ever tell them it's going to take 3 years because it's just never going to get blessed. I think the very common scenario is you always like tend to underestimate how long it takes because the human aspect of people moving to actually get the work done is the most challenging in most organizations. As your team size grows, as I mentioned at Uber, you're a small team, we can get some stuff quickly because everyone's on the same page. As your team grows, it's like, oh, I have to coordinate with that priority, this product launch. That's not going to make it in time. So I'm going to stay on this old version for a while. You figure it out, and then I'll move next quarter. Right? It's always the next quarter or the next half. And I think that's where things like automation can help because you can give them a nudge. But getting like a good understanding of the current lay of the land can be helpful. One of the things I think I've done over time is like always like create like some sort of documentation of, hey, where are we currently, like in the current state of the world, and what are the problems there, right? So everyone's on the same page that, hey, we understand that being here is not sustainable long term for these reasons, right? And everyone needs to know that before you even like start on the journey, right? It's kind of like you're on an old car that has like a lot of mileage and it's breaking down a lot. So you need to somehow at some point, like, either repair it or get a new car. So just knowing that is important. And then defining the target state, right? And this is where I think a lot of teams like overshoot their timelines. There's a thing that we did back at Uber. I think this could be common elsewhere as well, done and done, where you say that, hey, 80% or 90% is done. 95 might be like done, but it's always going to be like 5% who just never migrate, right? It's just the reality of large teams is there's always a long tail. Uh, Learning how to manage the long tail is important, but I don't think it's ever easy to just say we'll be done 100%. It's maybe in some cases it's possible, in most cases it's impossible. And so understanding how we can deal with the long tail, what does that mean in terms of engineering resources, right? How much of your team do you need to have to support that whole technology? And in some cases, you can say that, hey, it's probably just self-serve at that point. The team wants to stay on an old stack. They don't want to migrate. Then they have to dedicate resources. Put that in writing ahead of time. Right? That's very important so you don't get saddled with that as part of your progress you need to make. And prioritizing highest impact, lowest risk. Kind of going back to the risk aspect. If you can deliver quick value with a lot of impact while not having as much risk, it's the best option, obviously. I think one of the migrations we did was like a Java upgrade from 8 to 11, and we did that in like tiers. So the low, or like the tier 5 and tier 4 would go first. That was pretty quick. We would wait for like a few weeks, no issues. Then we would go for like the other tiers. But the size of the services were high enough that we could show like still high impact, even though the tiers were lower. So you kind of have to hack a little bit and find out what makes sense. It's a little bit of an art over time. As you do enough of these, you'll get a feel for how you can show that ROI and high impact low risk.
I think the big key thing is there's always going to be a little bit left over, is what I'm hearing you say. There's always going to be a little bit that you don't migrate over for whatever reason, because you're probably at some point going to remove that service and so forth. So spending the time to migrate just doesn't make sense. And that could be costly within itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing which the decommissioning thing is, people always say, hey, we're going to decommission this next half, so we're not going to migrate. But it's still kicking 2 years down the line. So having a way to say, okay, if you're going to decommission, then here's like an automated way it'll happen on a date. And then if it goes beyond that, then you're going to be like a support burden for us. So you need to make sure you have all of the sort of corner cases at least mapped out. You don't have to have answers for all of these, but hey, if this happens, like who's on the hook for maintaining this old stuff, right? And that is very important. And at some point, what happens is like the teams who are on older versions, they just don't find it tenable to work in like a more modern clone base. So they eventually do have to migrate. They will just decide to pay that cost at different time. So I think the milestoning is mostly about like getting that done and done kind of mapped out. So you're not stuck chasing like an impossible 100% goal.
So part of this project planning and setting up milestones is, you mentioned before, is testing. How much time should someone spend in testing?
As much time as possible early on. I think if you have your test harness set up really well very early on, then you will spend less time later. There's always an argument that, hey, at a large scale, like back at Uber, we had like a lot of different services and a lot of different teams. They all don't look the same. Right? Standardization is kind of key for being able to like minimize effort. When everything looks like different and you're dealing with pets, not cattle, so it's hard to kind of say, hey, this solution is going to work for every single team out there. Right? So one of the first things that we did back at Uber was we standardized before we tried to then migrate. Because basically try to bring them to the same sort of base level, then testing it becomes like a little bit of do it once, run it across the entire set of services rather than let's do it individually for every team, right? Because it's just never going to work. So spending some time to standardize could be one way you can kind of reduce the testing effort. But test early, don't do it too late, because if you do too late, then you may not even discover all the edge cases.
Kind of going back to the milestones and saying, okay, maybe let's say 90% we'll define as done versus done. How would you overall define success and track the progress for each milestone?
That's a good question. So I think the It really depends on the migration. I think one of the ways you would want to measure milestones is not just by completion, but like by business impact. So you could say that, hey, even if we did, let's say, 20% of the migration, it realized like 80% of the impact we had that we wanted to get. So you might just say 20% is all we need. The 80% can just, take whatever time they want. And one of the examples is, I think, when you do things like efficiency, you might have like a very high traffic service that gets a lot of compute resources. So you might decide, I'm just going to optimize, let's say, the compute or runtime performance with just that one service. That is a big chunk of our entire cost, infra cost. And you might decide the other ones are maybe not worth it. Right? And so in that case, it could be just like you just do the one or two of these, and that covers like 80% of what you want to get. So that could be done, and done could be like a longer term like selves get there, but don't try to try to do 100% because the juice may not be worth the squeeze, right? So it's very hard to do it like as like a prescriptive thing. It has to be very much case by case, right? So you have to kind of know the metrics, and I think that's the other thing we uh, want to talk about is like how do we define the right metrics? I think we kind of like talked about it briefly, but all the stuff around like securing executive sponsorship, showing progress, justifying ROI means you have a really good sense of the metrics that you're driving, right? So setting up dashboards, people love dashboards, obviously, especially leadership. So if you can set up dashboards where you're showing things go up or down, it's always like easy to sell your vision. So I think one of the good things to like get good at is like get good at like data analysis and like SQL and playing with the data to show the impact like early on. So that way we know where we are, where we're headed, and we're in the right direction.
So going back to automation, how much time should anyone spend trying to automate the workflow, identify versus doing manual effort? What amount of effort should be going into investing in the tools and automation, and what should people look for when trying to automate their migrations?
Yeah, this is like a topic very dear to me because I think uh, back at Uber when people were saying, hey, for example, one of the things is like, here's a best practice for writing how to write code. Like, this is how we should write code, right? So I think someone wrote like a really long document that here's our code style. You should follow this and do that. And 6 months later, they left and someone else came in. They wrote another document. So it never actually was enforced, right? So the only real way to like enforce things like that is like automating and enforcing it at like when you make a commit or when you write code in the IDE.
For the CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, or do it in the CI/CD pipeline or your local development pipeline. Just have a way to like enforce the team. So you teach them with the tool, and that's something that happens so frequently that it's not worth. It is worth actually automating and not just writing a document for, right? But if you're, let's say, doing a one-off migration, like just for example, you're going from one vendor tool to another vendor tool, you probably won't do that very often. So it may not be worth automating. Write a runbook, send it to everyone, let them kind of do it. Right? So it's very much case by case. I think analyzing the existing sort of like effort required to automate and like, is it really a bottleneck or is it like something that we do today only, or do we do it every day? Is important. I think that's one of the key things to identify before you even automate, right? Because it may not be worth spending a bunch of time automating something you only do once.
So about 20% of the time, you want to put in 20% of effort to help with the automation. Anything more, you might want to look at whether it's worth doing.
Yeah, that's a really good rule of thumb. Like if you put 20% of time, but you get 80% lift in like velocity or efficiency, that's when I think you would automate. Like do not try to automate everything wherever possible. I think that's why you say automate wherever possible. Don't try to overdo it because then you're just writing tools that won't be used more than a limited set of use cases. But it also in that same way, like getting the ROI for automation, we talked about a little bit. One of the other things I think folks realize when they do automation is it also requires maintenance over time, especially something that you have running every day. So if you're doing a code style, you upgrade like a newer version of the framework, you might have to update the automation to keep in sync with the framework, which means you need to train the team to understand how this automation works, how to like make it kind of work with newer versions. So training your team is also an essential part of automation. Don't just like make a tool and put it out there. Like document, train your team to like modify it, make them be able to extend it, right? So one of the things I think we did when we do things like automated code refactoring is we spend a lot of time like documenting the pieces that the framework supports, so you can use them to like achieve different use cases and have the team actually try out small sort of like recipes, so they get comfortable with like using the tool to actually get their job done. If it's too hard to use, no one else is going to use it. It's not going to get adoption. If it's like too simple, it may not actually be worth it because it may not handle all the use cases. So there's a fine balance between how widely you can apply something and what's the learning curve. And this is where I think some of the newer tools that are available using AI, they tend to promise a lot, but in our experience using them, it always seems to have a lot of like mixed results. So in some parts of the automation journey, I can help, especially like the really like, easy parts, but the harder parts tend to be really problematic. And one of the other harder parts that we, for example, had back at Uber was scaling it, right? So we had like millions of lines of code, which means any sort of simple AI thing that needs to read the entire code and digest it is just not going to work because code changes so frequently. And if
Especially when
you're
you're a fast-paced company and you're moving quickly and you're trying to release quickly.
yeah, like code change is constant. So if your tool can't keep up because it's changing so often, I mean, we've seen some tools, for example, that needs to compile the entire code base before they can run any sort of refactoring. That means like it can be a few hours before you can even run something, which is really painful. So the scaling part of it can also be like a really hard challenge for teams when they start thinking about automations. We need to have scalable tooling as well as use AI potentially in the right pieces. Right? So I think we gotta do some of this stuff back at Gitar as well. So if you're curious about learning more, you can like reach out to us on our social or Slack as well. We'll be happy to chat more in detail.
Yeah, before we dive into Q&A, I think some of the key takeaways here is, very clear communication, writing documentation, outlining the goals, and rolling that up not just to leadership, but also rolling it back down to your peers within the teams. A few other kind of key highlights for code migrations are necessary. I don't want to say necessary evil, but necessary for growth. Change is constant. It's part of life. And as long as you need to make sure it aligns with business goals, you can't just, you don't want to just migrate because it's a new shiny object that's out there right now. You really needs to help accelerate the growth, but also aligning the business impact to purchasing new tooling for automation and making sure that you are, like you said, 80% of accelerating your growth by 80% and only spending 20% of your time to automate. And the other big thing that I've heard from you is that you really want to do the research, which means test, because that will also help you plan effectively, figure out, your milestones and where you can, what is going to be considered done versus done. And then it also helps set expectations for the long tail. But automation can really help you as long as you're finding the right tools that work for your environment.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. We also have a few questions in chat, but hope this was helpful. And if you folks have more questions, like we're available at guitar.ai, you can hit us up. But happy to take more questions that you have and answer them.
So it looks like we have one question from Andres. What are the things you're measuring to track success to make sure impressions on both tech and product leadership makes an impression on both tech and product leadership?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of these things break down into like things like business goals, like cost, efficiency, or developers, but also there's product, which I don't think we've covered too deeply. Product leadership typically cares about velocity. So how quickly can you ship code with the least amount of defects, right? So one of the things we used to track back at Uber was what is the rate at which we can ship features, and also how many defects per, I think, 100 or 1,000 changes that we were making, right? So if you have less defects and are able to ship quickly, like a fast timeline, I think that was really helpful. And we drove efforts to kind of drive those numbers up over time. Right? I mean, like basically, of course, errors down, but also like velocity up. Right? So usually, product leadership cares about velocity and quality. So those tend to align well with like engineering leadership about, hey, how are we doing things like developer velocity and like cost, right? So I think that's like the fine balance where things tend to align. There are probably other ones which are unique to your business. There are some cases like very operational heavy businesses. Uber was very operational heavy. They were also like very much like in highly regulated markets with a lot of compliance needs. So there are other factors to consider as well when we try to ship quickly. We have to be very careful with like safety and regulatory frameworks, so we don't like actually ship something that has issues where we can lose licenses. So I think it really depends on the other stuff, but at least for product leadership and tech leadership, things like engineering velocity, product quality, and then like quality of the actual like number of caches could be very helpful proxies. I hope that answers your question, Andres.
Yeah, Andres, if you need any follow-up questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Next question is from Vishruth. Part of the reason for some migrations are to simplify the surface area the developer platform needs to support. How do we avoid having this only partially complete, inadvertently increasing the scope as a result?
This is a very specific question. It feels like it comes from a place of personal pain. We had this problem too, actually. I was on a developer platform team for a really long time, almost 10 years. And the reason for migration was always like, hey, we don't want to support this old system, right? How do we do it so that we don't get stuck with like 2 new systems to support? There's, I think, a very famous XKCD comic where they introduce a new standard, and now suddenly like everyone should use the new standard, but what ends up happening is you have 2 competing standards now, and people are like confused. So I think one of the few things I think we talked about briefly is like, of course, putting like things in place so you don't regress. So you have like a cap on, hey, we're moving to system B from A, no more new stuff in system A, and we're going to chip away at it, right? And you have to constantly make an effort to chip away at it, and then say that, okay, this amount of, yeah, I think so. You found the comment in the chat.
Oh, can't seem to add that visual, but
so you're going to find the comic. So basically, you want to find an acceptable amount of divergence, and you basically say, I'm not going to start another migration until I'm happy with where I am in terms of the support load for the existing stuff that's already diverged. So let's say you want to go from B to C eventually. You want to have very little A, so you don't overwhelm yourself with like, you don't overwhelm yourself with like more support load, because I think teams are getting smaller as we talked about, and they need to have a lot more context in their head. So sometimes it's okay to even just say no to it and say, hey, we already are supporting these things. So you can tell your leadership that, hey, to migrate, to get better cost efficiency, we can't do this stuff with A anymore. So you might even declare bankruptcy, which we did sometimes. We declared bankruptcy on, I think when we moved from Fabricated to Jira, we just dropped all the tickets on the floor and said, everything new is in Jira. No one cared about Fabricated. If you need to go look at it,
I remember Fabricator.
Right? And it's okay sometimes. That's another way you can kind of like control your downside and not take on too much more. I don't know. Hope that was helpful. But yeah, that's an uphill battle to fight for sure with your leadership.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. We will be sending over a survey, and if you could please fill that out, we would love to get some feedback from all of you. Hopefully this was helpful, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or would love to learn more, feel free to email me at serena.at-gitar.ai or Gautam@gitar.ai, and we'd love to hear from you. And we'll be sending out an email survey shortly. Alex has just tagged our website if you have any questions. Greatly appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Thanks.